Free speech under attack on all fronts. I'm Brian Lilly with the Rebel.media. I support free speech, but that, my friends, is a worrying statement to hear from anyone that lives in a liberal Western democracy like Canada. I support free speech, but that always means there's some kind of speech the person speaking would actually like to see shut down. And the problem with that is, where do you stop? Who draws the line? If you trust the current government to restrict speech that you don't like, then you have to ask yourself, what about the next government? The one that might be led by a leader you hate or that party you can't stand. Would you be comfortable handing over the ability to criminalize speech to those people? And yet, from people rioting to shut down civil discourse on campuses to calls for advertising bans, having the government police Twitter or Facebook posts, fake news, this is a worrying time for free speech. Here's the 5 ways that free speech is under attack. Number 1, riots. Number 2, fake news. Number 3, Twitter police. 4, ad bans. And 5, political targeting. Let's go through each one. Riots. From riots in Berkeley over Milo speaking to mini riots at the University of Toronto over Ezra speaking and even some nudity, anti-free speech activists, now calling themselves Antifa, short for anti-fascists, are trying to stop speeches, conferences, and any opinion they disagree with from being heard. Now, this is not as disturbing as the government shutting down speech using legislative action, but like so many of the campuses where free speech is infringed upon by speech codes or other actions, these campuses are public universities. They're owned by the government. They're run by the government. And neither institution, not Berkeley nor U of T, is doing enough to protect free speech. They allow these shutdown of events to happen. They encourage speech codes. Campuses are already the least safe place for free speech, and it's only likely to get worse over the next 4 years. Number 2, fake news. Fake news is not something new. It's not something that occurred for the first time with the advent of the 2016 U.S. presidential election. But since liberals are upset their candidate lost that election, they're trying to blame fake news and demand the government do something. Want to know one of the most common pieces of fake news that I spotted during the U.S. election? The one claiming that Donald Trump once said in an interview that if he were to run for president, he'd run as a Republican because their voters are so stupid. It was completely false, but lefties posted it everywhere. The presidential election didn't even involve Canadians, and yet we have politicians here calling for the government to act. Heritage Minister Melanie Joly pushing for Facebook and Google to do something. Several MPs wanting the Commons Heritage Committee to act on the file. That committee is led by Liberal MP Hedy Fry, who once stood in the Commons to denounce racism and claimed that in Prince George, British Columbia, crosses were burning as we speak. The claim of the KKK burning crosses on lawns in BC was completely untrue, just like much of what comes from the mouths of politicians. But now this woman and her colleagues want to investigate fake news. No one wants lies out there, but one of the biggest pushers of false stories are politicians with agendas trying to tear down their opponent, fluff themselves up. And these are the people that want to be the arbiters of fake news? You'll forgive me if I'm skeptical. They just want to push a political agenda. The next threat to free speech is the Twitter police. We've seen this happen in the UK, people arrested for tweets deemed hateful by the police, people prosecuted by the criminal courts for things that did not incite violence, didn't cross the libel or defamation thresholds, but still prosecuted. Now that's coming to Canada. In the wake of the horrific mosque shooting in Quebec City, plenty of people were voicing opinions online, but one Montreal man's now facing charges over a tweet. As Ezra Levant has already shown, the man in question, 46-year-old Antonio Padula, was arrested and charged after sending out a sarcastic tweet. Padula had been defending Muslims on Twitter with comments such as, if you had more than half the useless brain that you do, you would realize 99% of the billions of Muslims do not agree with those so-called rules. But while arguing, he also tweeted, I'm against all those things, and I need you to prove you are also by killing all refugees at the airport before they come rape your family. It was a strange way to argue, a kind of reductio absurdum, trying to ridicule his opponent's argument. My read of the whole Twitter thread and the whole argument is a defense of Muslim Canadians, but Padula was arrested by Montreal police after a tip-off by the provincial police cyber surveillance unit. Police cyber surveillance unit, that's scary stuff. The 4th way that free speech is under attack calls for ad bans. Let's be clear, advertising is a form of freedom of expression, which is guaranteed in the Charter. But now we have increasing calls for banning advertising. And no, I'm not talking about Justin Trudeau and the Liberals banning Government of Canada advertising on Breitbart because they don't like that website. I'm talking about activists like the Heart and Stroke Foundation calling for the feds to ban advertising of food and beverages aimed at children. The so-called evidence on this is weak at best, in my view, non-existent. Even the Heart and Stroke report plays up polls about the way people feel more than it does science. If you want to curtail free speech, you better have a good reason for it with solid evidence, not a poll about feelings. And finally, the fifth threat, government attempts at de-radicalization. For years now, governments have tried to claim that they can take someone like a jihadist, someone committed to Islamist terrorism, and reform them. Now they want to add domestic political movements that they don't like. The effectiveness of the current de-radicalization programs are in question, but now Public Safety Minister wants to add the alt-right, according to Global News. I couldn't even tell you what the alt-right is. I know the term's thrown around a lot. I know some people have defined it in the past, but now it seems to be the catch-all for anyone that folks on the left don't like. In many ways, it's the new neocon. That was a term that has had a specific definition once upon a time, but it became meaningless as the left used it as a pejorative insult. So when a government starts talking about taking on a political idea or movement with a de-radicalization process, doesn't that make you feel a little squeamish? Doesn't it remind you of 1984? Freedom of speech, freedom of expression, it's all taken for granted. But as we've seen in the past with issues like Section 13 of the Human Rights Act, the hurt feelings on the internet section, many people, including elected officials, are more than happy to let freedom of speech be curtailed for the latest fashionable idea. The answer, when asked though, should always be no. If you liked the video you just watched, click subscribe. Never miss a Rebel video again.